3 months after Dean Martin's son died, he returned to The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson had prepared questions. But when Dean sat down, Johnny did something that broke every rule of late-night television. The date was March 24th, 1987. Dean Martin had not been seen in public since the funeral. His son, Dean Paul Martin, a captain in the California Air National Guard, had died when his F-4 Phantom fighter jet crashed into the San Bernardino Mountains during a training exercise. The wreckage was found scattered across a frozen ridge. Dean Paul was 35 years old. The nation knew Dean Martin as the man who never broke character, the smooth singer, the ironic drunk who wasn't really drunk, the performer who made everything look easy, who treated fame like a game he'd already won. For decades, he'd walked onto stages and into living rooms with that half smile, that relaxed posture, that voice that sounded like it came from a place where nothing truly hurt. But his son was gone. The Tonight Show bookers had reached out carefully. There was no pressure. If Dean wanted to cancel, everyone would understand. But Dean's manager called back within hours. Dean wanted to come. He needed to come. He didn't explain why, and no one asked him to. Johnny Carson received the confirmation while reviewing his monologue notes. He set down his pen and stared at the name written on the guest list. Dean Martin, scheduled for the second segment, after the monologue and a stand-up comedian. Standard placement for a major star. But nothing about this was standard. Johnny had known Dean for nearly 30 years. They had shared stages, hotel bars, golf courses, and the particular loneliness that comes with being watched by millions while feeling utterly alone. Johnny understood the performance. He lived inside his own version of it every night. The difference was that Dean had perfected the art of seeming unreachable even when he was right in front of you. Johnny had always admired that distance. Now he feared it. The afternoon before the taping, Johnny did something unusual. He dismissed his writers from the pre-show meeting early and asked his producer, Fred de Cordova, to stay behind. "What are we doing tonight?" Johnny asked. Fred understood the question wasn't about the lineup. "We have the standard sheet. Questions about his career, maybe a story about Sinatra, ease into..." "No," Johnny said. "What are we actually doing?" Fred was quiet for a moment. "I don't know." "Neither do I," Johnny said. This was the problem. The Tonight Show operated on a precise architecture of conversation. Every question had been tested. Every story beat had been timed. Guests were guided through emotional arcs that felt spontaneous but were actually carefully constructed to serve the rhythm of the show. Laughter had to build. Sentiment had to land before the commercial break. Nothing could feel accidental, even though everything had to appear unrehearsed. But you couldn't architect grief. Johnny had interviewed people in mourning before. He knew how to handle it. You acknowledged the loss with sincerity, gave them space to speak if they wanted to, then gently redirected toward lighter territory. The audience appreciated compassion, but they also needed release. They needed to laugh again. That was the contract. Except Johnny didn't want to redirect Dean Martin toward anything. He didn't want to manage the moment or serve the rhythm of the show. He wanted to sit with his friend, and he wasn't sure that was the same thing as doing his job. "Let me talk to him," Fred said. "Before he goes on, see where his head is." "Don't," Johnny said. Fred looked at him. "Johnny, I mean it. Don't prep him. Don't give him an out. Just let him come out." Fred nodded slowly, but his expression showed concern. The Tonight Show had aired for 25 years under Johnny's command because Johnny controlled every variable. He didn't improvise. He didn't gamble with live television. But this felt different. This felt like Johnny was preparing to let go of something. The studio filled that evening with the usual energy. The audience arrived with expectations shaped by decades of watching Johnny Carson. They expected smoothness. They expected wit. They expected to leave feeling better than when they arrived. Dean Martin's name was on the guest list printed in the lobby, and people murmured about it with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Everyone knew what had happened to Dean Paul. No one knew what to expect. Backstage, Dean Martin sat alone in his dressing room. He had arrived early, which was unlike him. For most of his career, Dean had perfected the art of showing up exactly when needed and not a moment sooner. It was part of his mystique. He didn't linger. He didn't fuss. He performed, then disappeared. But tonight he'd arrived 90 minutes before taping. A production assistant had offered him coffee, water, anything he needed. Dean had smiled, that familiar, gentle smile, and said he was fine. The assistant left, and Dean sat in the chair facing the mirror, surrounded by lights. He didn't look at his reflection. He looked past it, at something the mirror couldn't show. His suit was impeccable. Charcoal gray, perfectly tailored. His hair was combed with the same care it had always received. His hands were steady. To anyone glancing in, Dean Martin looked exactly like Dean Martin. But he wasn't wearing the mask yet. That would come later, when the stage lights hit him and the audience began to applaud. For now, he was just a father who had buried his son 3 months ago and didn't know why he'd agreed to be here. Except he did know. He needed to be in front of people. He needed to sit across from someone who understood the performance and might let him stop performing. He needed Johnny Carson, who had lost his own son, Richard, in a car accident 6 years earlier. Johnny had never spoken about it publicly. He'd taken 2 weeks off, then returned to The Tonight Show and continued as if nothing had changed. Dean had watched those episodes. He'd seen how Johnny's eyes looked different, even when he was laughing. The stage manager knocked softly. "Mr. Martin, we're at Places in 10 minutes. Dean stood. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, and the mask slid into place, smooth, easy, untouchable. Johnny Carson finished his monologue to strong applause. The jokes had landed well, something about Ronald Reagan's latest press conference, a bit about a new diet fad. The audience was warm, receptive. Johnny glanced toward the guest entrance as he transitioned into the first segment. A young comedian came out, performed a tight 7 minutes, got good laughs, and left. The show was running on schedule. Then Doc Severinsen and the band played the intro music for Dean Martin. The audience erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was an outpouring, a standing ovation that began before Dean even appeared. People loved Dean Martin. They loved him for his music, for his movies, for the Dean Martin Show, for the Rat Pack, for every smooth, effortless moment he'd given them over 40 years. But tonight, the applause carried something else. It carried sympathy. It carried sorrow. It carried the collective weight of a nation that had watched this man lose his child and didn't know how to tell him they cared. Dean walked through the curtain. He waved. He smiled. He moved with that familiar, unhurried grace. He shook Johnny's hand, and Johnny held it a moment longer than usual. The audience continued clapping as Dean sat in the guest chair. He crossed his legs, settled back, and waited for the noise to fade. It took nearly a minute. When the studio finally quieted, Johnny looked at Dean, not at the audience, not at the camera, at Dean. "Dean," Johnny said softly. Dean nodded. "Johnny." There was a silence. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt vast. Johnny had note cards in his hand, prepared questions written in his producer's neat handwriting. He set them down on the desk without looking at them. "How are you?" Johnny asked. It was the simplest question, the most human question, and the most impossible to answer honestly on television. Dean's smile didn't falter. "I'm okay, John." Johnny nodded. He didn't push. He didn't ask Dean to elaborate. He didn't pivot to a safer topic. He just sat with the answer, letting it exist in the space between them. The audience waited. The cameras continued rolling. The show had a rhythm, a structure, a momentum that needed to be maintained. But Johnny Carson, who had built his entire career on controlling that momentum, let it go. "We don't have to do this," Johnny said quietly. Dean looked at him, and for just a moment, something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, not in a way that most of the audience would even notice, but Johnny saw it. The mask slipped just slightly. "I wanted to come," Dean said. "I needed to be here." "Why?" Johnny asked. It was a bold question, maybe even a reckless one. Guests didn't come on The Tonight Show to be asked why they'd agreed to appear. They came to promote something, to tell stories, to be charming. But Johnny wasn't treating Dean like a guest. He was treating him like a friend who'd shown up after months of silence, and he needed to understand what that meant. Dean was quiet for a long moment. The studio remained silent. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. Millions of people were watching, and somehow the moment felt private. "I don't know," Dean said finally. "I think I needed to remember how to be in front of people." Johnny nodded. And I'm not sure I remember." The honesty of it cut through everything. Dean Martin, the man who had made a career out of seeming effortlessly comfortable in any spotlight, was admitting that he felt lost. Not with big emotional declarations, not with tears or dramatic pauses, just with a simple, quiet confession. Johnny leaned back in his chair. He was silent for several seconds, and the cameras stayed on both of them. The director, watching from the booth, made no move to cut away. Fred de Cordova, standing in the wings, didn't signal for a commercial break. Everyone understood that something was happening that couldn't be scripted or controlled. "You know what I think about?" Johnny said. "I think about how stupid this all is." Dean looked at him, curious. "This," Johnny gestured around the studio. "The show, the lights, the applause, all of it. We spend our whole lives building these performances, and we get very good at it. People think they know us because they watch us every night, but they don't. They know the character, and after a while, we forget there's a difference." Dean didn't respond, but his eyes stayed on Johnny. "And then something real happens," Johnny continued. "Something that doesn't fit into the performance, and you realize how much of your life you've spent pretending to be someone you're not. Not lying exactly, just editing, cutting out everything that doesn't fit the image." The audience was completely still. This wasn't what anyone had expected. This wasn't Johnny Carson, the talk show host. This was Johnny Carson, the person, speaking to his friend on national television in a way that felt almost transgressive. "I'm sorry about your son," Johnny said. "I know you know that. Everyone knows that. But I'm sorry in a way that most people can't be, because I understand what it means. And I want you to know that you don't have to perform tonight. You don't have to be Dean Martin. You can just be Dean." Dean's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in his posture softened. The wall he'd maintained for decades, the one that kept everyone at a safe distance, developed a crack. "I don't know how to be just Dean anymore," Dean said quietly. "I've been this version of myself for so long, I don't remember what the original looked like." Johnny nodded. Yeah, they sat together in that acknowledgement. Two men who had spent their entire adult lives performing versions of themselves for public consumption, admitting that they'd lost track of where the performance ended and the person began. The commercial break never came. The band didn't play. Johnny didn't transition to a funny story or ask Dean about his latest project. They just talked. Not in the carefully structured way that talk show conversations usually unfolded, but in the meandering, uncertain way that real conversations happened. Dean talked about his son, not in detail, not with dramatic revelations. He talked about small things, how Dean Paul used to call him every Sunday, how he'd been proud of his military service, how the last conversation they'd had was about nothing important, just plans to play golf the following week. "That's what gets you," Dean said. "It's not the big moments, it's the stupid everyday stuff. I keep thinking about that golf game we never played." Johnny listened without interrupting. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't try to find the silver lining. He just let Dean speak. At one point, Dean smiled, a real smile, not the performance version. "You know what's funny? My whole life, I played the drunk, the guy who couldn't take anything seriously, and people loved it. They loved that I was always loose, always joking, but I wasn't, really. I was actually pretty serious, pretty careful. I just learned how to make it look easy." "Why?" Johnny asked. "Because that's what people wanted," Dean said. "They wanted to believe that life could be that simple, that you could just walk through it with a glass in your hand and a song on your lips, and I wanted to give them that. It felt like a gift." "Was it?" Johnny asked. Dean considered the question. "I don't know anymore." The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes. No commercial breaks. No interruptions. The producers in the booth had long since abandoned any attempt to maintain the show's usual structure. They let the cameras roll, understanding that they were capturing something rare. Johnny talked about his own son. He'd never done this publicly before. He didn't go into details, didn't share private grief for public consumption, but he acknowledged the loss in a way he never had. He told Dean that after Richard died, he'd convinced himself that if he just kept working, kept performing, kept being Johnny Carson, he could outrun the pain. "Did it work?" Dean asked. "No," Johnny said. "It just made me better at pretending it had." The audience watched in near silence. Some people were crying. Others sat transfixed, understanding that they were witnessing something that violated every convention of television. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't even really an interview. It was two men being honest with each other in front of millions of people, and the vulnerability of it was almost overwhelming. Eventually, Johnny looked at the camera for the first time since Dean had sat down. "We need to take a break," he said. "Dean, thank you for being here." "Thank you for letting me be here," Dean said. They shook hands again, and Dean stood. The audience applauded, but it was different from the standing ovation that had greeted him. This was quieter, more reverent. As Dean walked off stage, Johnny remained seated, watching him go. The commercial break finally came. In the booth, the director exhaled. Fred de Cordova walked onto the stage and approached Johnny, who was still sitting at his desk, staring at nothing. "That was," Fred started, then stopped. He didn't have words for what it was. "I know," Johnny said. "We're going to get calls," Fred said. "That wasn't what people expect from the Tonight Show." "I know," Johnny repeated. He looked up at Fred. "I don't care." The show resumed after the commercial break with a musical guest. Johnny introduced them with his usual polish, and the show returned to its familiar rhythm. But something had shifted. The audience could feel it. The crew could feel it. Johnny Carson had broken his own rules, and in doing so had revealed something true about the cost of fame, the weight of grief, and the fragility of the personas we construct. Dean Martin never returned to The Tonight Show after that night. He performed occasionally over the next few years, but his appearances grew increasingly rare. He retreated from public life, no longer interested in maintaining the performance. Friends said he'd lost something essential when Dean Paul died, the will to pretend, perhaps, or the ability to separate himself from his pain. Johnny Carson continued hosting The Tonight Show for another 5 years. He rarely spoke about that night with Dean Martin, but crew members noticed changes in how he conducted interviews after that. He was less interested in the predictable stories, less focused on maintaining perfect control. He gave his guests more space to be uncertain, to be vulnerable, to be human. The network executives were nervous about the episode. They worried it had been too raw, too uncomfortable. But the ratings were strong, and the response from viewers was overwhelming. People wrote letters thanking Johnny for the interview. They said it felt real in a way that television rarely did. They said it reminded them that famous people hurt the same way everyone else hurts. But the real impact wasn't measurable in ratings or letters. It was in the private understanding between two men who had spent their lives performing and had chosen, for one night, to stop. Years later, after Johnny Carson had retired and Dean Martin had died, a Tonight Show crew member was interviewed for a documentary about Dean. The interviewer asked what he remembered most about that final appearance. "The silence," the crew member said. "I'd worked on the show for 15 years, and I'd never heard it that quiet. The audience, the band, everyone, we all just stopped. And I remember thinking that we were watching something that wasn't supposed to happen on television, something too real." The interviewer asked what Johnny and Dean had talked about during the commercial break when the cameras were off. "Nothing," the crew member said. "They just sat there. Dean didn't go backstage. Johnny didn't review his notes. They just sat in those chairs, not talking, for the entire break. And when we came back from commercial, Johnny's eyes were red. I'd never seen that before." The interviewer pressed, "Did the crew member think Johnny regretted doing the interview that way? Regretted abandoning the format?" "No," the crew member said. "I think it was the only interview Johnny Carson ever did that he was actually proud of." That night marked the end of something, though no one recognized it at the time. It was the end of Dean Martin as a public figure, yes, but it was also the end of a certain kind of television, the kind where everything had to be controlled, managed, packaged for easy consumption. Johnny Carson had spent 25 years perfecting that control, and in one evening, he'd chosen to release it. Dean Martin had come to The Tonight Show looking for something. Permission to stop performing, perhaps, or recognition from someone who understood the cost of the performance. Johnny had given him both. He'd asked the questions no one was supposed to ask. He'd acknowledged the losses that were supposed to remain private. He'd broken the unwritten rules of late-night television because his friend needed him to. And in doing so, he'd created a moment that revealed the truth behind every performance, that we are all pretending, all the time, and sometimes the kindest thing we can do for each other is to stop pretending together. The cameras captured it all, the silence, the honesty, the cracks in the masks that two men had worn for decades. And for 12 million people watching at home, it was a reminder that beneath every polished performance, every effortless smile, every seemingly carefree gesture, there was a human being who hurt and hoped and tried to make sense of a world that rarely made sense. Dean Martin left The Tonight Show that night and returned to his quiet life. Johnny Carson continued hosting, but differently, more gently, more honestly. And the footage remained, preserved in the NBC archives, a testament to the night two performers chose truth over entertainment and reminded everyone watching that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're not okay. 3 months after losing his son, Dean Martin sat across from Johnny Carson and said he didn't know how to be in front of people anymore. And Johnny Carson, who had built an empire on being in front of people, said that was okay. They could figure it out together. They never did figure it out, not really. But for 20 minutes on national television, they stopped trying to, and that was enough.